and hopefully...
Thank you.
Okay, all good?
All good.
Great. Okay, well, yeah, thanks again, Laura, and thank you to the group for inviting me to speak today. So my subject today is LiDAR and citizen science, and we'll get into maybe some of the definitions that we mean by that in the course of this talk. I think probably everyone who's on this group and in this call is familiar with LiDAR, so I'm not going to be speaking too much about the LiDAR data itself, other than that, it's so familiar to us as a tool in archaeology now that, it's really thrown up some challenges and as well as some opportunities that, I think it's really important for us to face up to. And I think if we're honest with ourselves as a profession, it's fair to say that there's been some trepidation in some of the challenges that LiDAR has presented with us, and the sense of just the sheer scale of this big data set, and the resolutions that it offers us. And I think some of that trepidation comes from, how we approach the interpretation, how appropriate it is to make that accessible to, a wide audience, to the wider heritage sector, and how much we can trust some of the information that comes out of what people see in that data. It's probably, it's hard to think of an equivalent of this sort of scale of change in data that's available to us now. It's a bit like saying that we've got geophysics for the whole country or something like that, or giving access to the whole British Museum's artifact catalogue without, any information, and then expecting sensible data to come out of people looking at it. So one of the things I want to do is just look at the ways that might be possible, some of the pitfalls and, some of the opportunities that this throws up. Okay, so first thing to say is that LiDAR and citizen science, the two things are quite often linked. We hear about initiatives that try and take this approach quite often, and there's many of them that are live and running at the moment. And there's some really good examples that are not only bigger in scale and complexity, but more technically ambitious than some of the stuff I'm going to be talking about. So I think it's important to think of citizen science in the sense of, like, in the broadest sense, as being something quite diverse. The objectives that are set out in individual projects isn't always the same, and that is something to bear in mind. My own personal experience is working with LiDAR probably for the last 15 years or so. We did some of the first large-scale LiDAR surveys in Scotland, and my involvement has always been along the lines of trying to get people to engage with that data. And when I say people, I mean the wider public as part of a public archaeology initiative. So that's been part of the interest for me. But I've worked on projects, all across the north of the UK, but also in Shropshire. And I got different scales of interaction with, the kind of data that comes out of this. It's worth saying that, I mentioned that other projects, and, there's probably colleagues on this call who are running projects like this. I know Dig Ventures are involved in this sort of thing. And, there's been really good examples in places like the Chilterns, for example, in looking at LiDAR on a big scale like this. To my mind, the best recent discussion of this is Bourgeois' paper in Antiquity last year, which looks at the major initiative carried out in the Netherlands looking at this stuff. And he really sets out some of the important factors in terms of the pitfalls and the challenges in terms of getting good data, reliable data out of involving people in this sort of project. Okay, so I just wanted to signpost that paper. I'm not claiming that my view on this stuff is definitive by any means, and what I want to do is put in front of you, one approach to this sort of material and this sort of project. And I think there's probably some things that we can highlight as key wins, but also challenges for the future and things that we can take into future initiatives. Just a very brief introduction to the Tweed project then. So the reason I'm speaking today is that we are currently running a project looking at the entire River Tweed basin, the Tweed being one of the major rivers in Scotland, runs from west to east, from the uplands in the southern uplands down to Tweed, and looking at the corridor of that basin, of that river basin. Now, the advantage that we have is that in this part of the country is that we have very good LiDAR coverage for that study area. So and we have the Scottish Remote Sensing Portal's data for pretty much all of our study area. So what we've been tasked with doing is using that as a basis for developing this heritage initiative, this heritage engagement project. And I do want to kind of just emphasize that that is our remit. You know, it's really important in all projects in archaeology, but, you know, particularly on a project like this, a sort of a regional survey project, to remember what it is we're trying to achieve here. Like, the River Tweed is almost 160 miles long. There's, you know, we're only looking at a corridor a couple of kilometers either side of the river itself, but that brings in, you know, upwards of 5,000-6,000 sites and monuments. You know, so what we're talking about doing here isn't a national mapping program. You know, we're not looking at every single site or monument and trying to to redefine that or add new records to it. It's just simply not in the scope of this project. But what is first and foremost is the engagement part of it. You know, so what we're looking to do is bring people along with us on this journey, get them to look at the archaeology around them, try and understand it better, and then, you know, build on that with new data that we can contribute. Now, I think, to my mind, these things aren't contradictory aims. You know, we want people to engage with the archaeology, but we want our project to produce something useful. And that's something that I want to kind of focus on in this talk. So how can we get useful data out of a project like this? So our aims under the sub-project of mapping the Tweed then are to look again at the river basin. So it's actually quite a well-surveyed area, a well-surveyed part of Scotland. It's a long tradition of you know, antiquarian interest, but also in the 20th century, Royal Commission Order Survey and Royal Commission surveys, particularly in the period from the post-war decades up to the 60s, where, you know, most of this study area was surveyed systematically and to a high standard by the Royal Commission. So what can a project like this add to that data set? Well, we want to engage again with that material. We want to open people's eyes to what's around them, but we also want to look and to identify new features. You know, obviously that's a key part of looking at LiDAR data, is what could be there that we've not seen before. And that's not just new monuments, of which we have many good examples, but looking to redefine existing monuments that we know quite well already. And that again is something that's come out of this work. The other aims are to form a framework for the field program. So we want to get people out there doing this stuff and looking at this archaeology. And it also sets the research agenda for, you know, the excavation program for the invasive works that we're doing alongside this. So, you know, it's all about using the LiDAR as a structure for understanding landscape and asking new questions of the material that's in front of us. So this question then about what makes good data. So this is, you know, was fundamental to our thinking about how to approach this project. So it's one thing to present LiDAR data and make it accessible to people. It's another thing to ask them to contribute their thoughts on it. But how do we marshal that into something that's, you know, going to help us and contribute to what we know about the archaeology? And that made us reflect quite long and hard about, you know, what is it reasonable to expect of a project like this. And again, I do go back to my point that I made at the start about understanding the scope, you know, what it is we're setting out to achieve here. There's no way a project like this, with its limited resources and funding and timescale, is going to be the equivalent of a national mapping program, and it doesn't set out to be. That's the remit of HES and other organisations, you know, to catalogue the full extent of the monuments we see. But it is reasonable to expect that we can bring people along with us in such a way that looking at this data is going to produce material that's useful to a national mapping program, for example, and that is something that we want to do. So we want to make sure that our contribution is usable, you know. So, and I think that one way to think about this is to look at the National Library's presentation of LiDAR, for example, which is superb. You know, for those of you that are familiar with the resource that the National Map Library makes available online, you know, interactive, cross-referenceable maps and processed hillshades for LiDAR of a large part of Scotland, and that's an ongoing process with new data being added all the time. But it's one thing to present that data, but it's another thing to coordinate the incoming interpretation. And then we start to ask ourselves, so to what extent is it reasonable to expect people who are not archaeologists, not people with a background in field archaeology and landscape archaeology, to understand what they're doing and to know how to produce useful data? And I think that's something that's not a black and white thing. I think that there's not a yes or no answer to that. So it's possible to bring people along with us and for them to learn as they do that, and to get better at this and to understand the things they're looking at better. So this is key point number one. So we start with training. Again, I think there'll be people on this call who have carried out similar projects, who are involved in similar projects, but almost universally, people who do this kind of project emphasize the need for induction, for training participants in understanding what it is they're looking at. So that's where we start. It's a basic introduction to what is LiDAR, what's aerial laser scan data, and what are the products you get out of it. We start at the basics. We start with the source point clouds. We help people to understand what rasters are, what digital elevation models are, the difference between surface models and bare earth models, for example. Basic introduction to understanding LiDAR data. The next key part, of course, for those of us familiar with working with LiDAR data, is knowing what visualizations are. Now, again, I want to kind of get across that this is all about making people familiar with, how LiDAR data gets treated and what they might be looking at. So understanding visualizations is about understanding what's come out of the box. So it's okay to use RVT, the Relief Visualization Toolbox, to produce visualizations and not necessarily understand the maths behind how those raster calculations are done. But it is important to understand what they're showing you, and to avoid the pitfalls of some of the mistakes that you might be fooled into making if you didn't understand that. So we tried to design our training program to introduce people to the basic stuff, and get increasingly more and more complex as we went along, so that those people who really wanted to get into the guts of it, who wanted to understand spatial data processing, could do that. But at the very least, you had to understand what slopes are showing you, and the difference between multi-directional and single directional hillshades, for example. The other thing that's very important to do in any citizen science projects, I believe, is to make people aware of the mistakes that they can make. And this category of red herrings was something that we spent a lot of time on. So making people aware of how the data is processed, but then going on to make them appreciate how that can translate into artifacts, data artifacts. So why does the ground look textured the way it does? Why do we have these strange wavy lines in the data, and what do they mean? And that can be a simple case of just explaining how that has resulted, but also looking at individual examples of where certain features might present as if they look like archaeology but aren't archaeology. So we want people to understand the pitfalls, and that's again a key part of avoiding poor data. And again, just being critical of the data, encouraging people to think about the data, what it appears to be. So we present these bare earth models, but as those of us who have worked with spatial data, LiDAR will know, a bare earth model in inverted commas isn't always bare. So you have to understand things that can and can't be stripped away out of various levels of aggression in processing, and then getting people to understand that there may be differences in different land zones in terms of what data is visible. So again, just encouraging familiarity and a sort of a critical thinking approach to the data itself. The other thing that I did do in our training was to spend some time boring everyone by talking about the background data, geomorphology, understanding historic land use, for example. fluvial glacial processes and, understanding a little bit about why the landscape looks the way it does, it's really important to developing, a trained eye in terms of spotting patterns in archaeology. And what we're trying to do there is really get people to develop a sense for the kind of rhythms of the field monuments of the study area. And I think anyone who's worked on, regional archaeological surveys will understand what I mean by that, is that you get a feeling for the recurring patterns in the data and the recurring patterns in the sites and monuments you're looking at. And so we wanted people to understand why things look the way they do, why they're located where they are, and also to kind of look for trends in the underlying topography, so that they could, they were better, their eyes were better trained to spot interesting features. And the final part of the training was really to encourage this sense of critical thinking. And this is probably the most challenging part of what we have to do, and this is probably the part that intimidates or worries professional archaeologists the most, is that how can we be sure that what people are seeing and what they're recording fits with what we know about the context. So we spent some time looking at the archaeological record for our study area about the past publications and looking at some of the survey data that exists already. But most importantly, thinking about it in a critical sense, so scrutinizing, why did people think that? And is it correct? Are there any potential reinterpretations that we could bring to some of these sites by looking at them again? So this idea of being sort of alert to the sense of conventional wisdom, just because something says it has a label cairn, for example, does that mean it's a cairn? If someone's called it a fort, is that the right thing to think about, the right way to think about that enclosure? So this is the archaeological part of the engagement that we were keen to emphasize. Now, lastly, we did go into the guts of data processing, and I've just put in some little snapshots of some of the training sessions we did here. And this was the bit that, I said earlier that we tried to do the training on a gradient. So we wanted everyone to have a basic familiarity with processing and what's possible. But we did ramp right the way up to introducing people to, advanced visualization techniques and working with data in QGIS, for example. Now, that's not something that everyone's going to do, but it is important for people to be aware of what's possible. And I think, what was rewarding was that, to me, it shows that there is actually a significant proportion of the participant group who does want to take it that far, and we did get some very good results out of people's, interrogation and reprocessing of source data. So although it's scary for some people, not everyone wants to get into this stuff, that's okay. That doesn't mean they can't contribute to the project, but I think it is important to give people the opportunity to take it as far as they see fit. So the data collection and management part of our project then, this is probably the area where things have changed the most in the time that I have been doing work with LiDAR and public archaeology projects. And just purely in the sense that it's so much easier to make this stuff accessible now. So we, as an organization, AOC, we're quite heavy Esri users. So we use the Esri platform, the ArcGIS online platform, to make this data accessible to people. But the simplicity that there's involved in doing that, you can present, many gigabytes of tiled hillshade data, for example, to people with modestly spec'd PCs, pretty simply. And it can be set up to be interactive so that people can contribute their data or through to a back-end data source, which is synced to our side. But part of it, part of the making this project successful is about making this interactive experience user-friendly. So people need to be able to easily access existing data, sites and monuments records, that kind of thing, but also historic map data. And we tried to structure our interface. This is all built on Esri's Experience Builder. Other platforms are available, of course. We just happen to be Esri users. There are other ways to achieve the same thing just as effectively, but this was a good solution for us. But part of what we were doing was making all of the things that we had brought into the training, all the cross-referencing, all the corroboration evidence, as accessible as possible. And we built into things like prompts, just to get people to think about what are the pitfalls that we talked about? Could this be something that it doesn't appear to be? And so this is all, all user-friendly stuff, user experience stuff. And again, the major change that has occurred in the past few years is, just the ease of which you can access some of these things. So bringing in the National Library's web map tiles for first edition Ordnance Survey, for example, is a simple thing, so people have the two data sets easily to hand. Okay, so in terms of results, we so far have something in the region of well over 300 entries added to the dataset. And now, again, bearing in mind that this is a well-studied, well-surveyed area, this is probably in the region of 300 significant new contributions in terms of new features. And they range from, areas of rig and furrow, ridge and furrow cultivation, all the way up to, major fortifications that had escaped detection before. So, in terms of success rate, it's high, I think, in terms of, the number of good, significant contributions we've received. But it is also telling us something about, the landscape and the study area that we're working in. The number of reliably identified sites drops off as we head down towards Berwick in the study area, for example, because, we're into the highly improved landscape, the sort of intensively cultivated land. So, this is in itself a learning process for the group that's involved. They're understanding the patterns of the distribution patterns of monuments and why, some things show up much better in some areas than others. So the sites and monuments that are tagged and identified by users come into us on the back end. It's all synced to a geodatabase that's pulled down into ArcGIS for verification. We look at these things, we assess them for our confidence levels in the identification that's been suggested. We make sure that the correction, the location that has been pinned is correct and can be verified. And then we edit and augment the user's description. So, we turn that into the kind of description that we would expect to see. So there's a little bit of finessing that goes on. Again, we've done feedback sessions for the users that have taken part in this to help them understand, the ways to describe these monuments and the things that they see. I know we've also made some of the cross-reference links. So if sites appear on historic maps, for example, we make sure that that's noted in our data sets. So in terms of the actual results, some of the things that have come out of this, as I say, we've had a range of outcomes. So everything from, fairly recent agricultural features of the landscape, enclosures, field systems, that kind of thing, to really quite significant, prehistoric settlements, for example, upstanding prehistoric settlements. The number of scooped and terrace settlements, these late Iron Age enclosures that are quite typical of this part of southern Scotland. We've added a good number of these to the data set through people's identification. So, and one of our key excavations actually is on one of these late Iron Age settlements over near Moffat in the west end of the study area. So adding context to that excavation in terms of being able to map and better understand new examples in the study area is really, valuable data. But, other things, enclosures in areas of woodland, forestry plantations and things, fortified enclosures, substantial monuments that have just escaped detection before, and often for good reasons. You can see why they're obscured and wouldn't have been easy to detect without LiDAR, but other quite surprising discoveries, and sometimes in plain sight, and of all periods as well. So we have prehistoric monuments, we have unenclosed platform settlements, we have hut circles, we have potential burnt mounds, but we also have much more recent things like medieval and later cultivation enclosures, and some really quite significant monuments as well relating to these later centuries. Some of these examples like this one, fragments of semi-relic landscape, rig and furrow cultivation, but also showing evidence for the later periods. So in this example here, we've got rig and furrow surrounding a substantial rectilinear enclosure, but overlain by the disused railway. So in this image, you're seeing how the site looks in the top right there today. The railway depicted on the historic map, and then in the LiDAR showing the earlier features on that in that landscape. So again, for the participants, it's a really good case study in teasing apart the different elements and different periods of use and activity in these landscapes. And again, just some highlights just to emphasize that, some really quite significant monuments have come out of this. This is a multi-valley enclosure at Jedderfield, just outside Peebles, one of the best surveyed areas of Scotland. A fort, effectively, an Iron Age fort that hasn't been detected before, and picked up by one of our participants. So, good quality, useful data, important monuments, being contributed to the record. And following on from the identifications, we've encouraged people to, where they can do it safely and with permission and so on, to go out and look at these things. So they've been doing this both on their own and accompanied by the AOC survey team, but also so adding to additional information to that, but also adding new visualizations. So using some of the techniques that going back to the primary processing of the data sets to interrogate their own interpretations and verify what they can and can't see on the ground. So again, this is all stuff that we might do routinely on a professional level, but just goes to show that with the right hand-holding, we can bring people who are novices and new to this stuff to produce really quite valuable and important data. And again, just feeding back to the reasons for our project, the scope of our project, this has provided material, and this is one of the sort of standout sites from the LiDAR assessment. This is a small excavation that we carried out at this feature you can see on the left-hand side of this slide, which is almost certainly a new moated enclosure, a moated settlement of medieval date. So, a high status medieval monument, medieval settlement, completely unrecorded, hiding in plain sight, identified as part of this program, leading on to research excavations to test, date, function, and so on, that kind of thing. So bringing people along with that whole journey in terms of archaeological investigation. Okay, so I kind of rattled through a lot of stuff at high level here, but just to kind of give you a taste of what we've been doing and how we've approached it. I think there are some next steps for us to do. I mean, I think that one of the most important things that we have to do in terms of our data management is to ensure we have good compatibility with the National Monuments Record, with the HERs, where this data will ultimately end up. And I think there are things to work on in that sense. And also we need to think about how we can make this data even more valuable, and whether it's feasible to involve people in the polygonization stage of that. That's something that may or may not be feasible within the scope of this project, but it's something that we're looking at as a next step. So hopefully I've presented some of the ways that data sets like this and projects like this can be a really valuable tool for engagement with wider audience in the heritage sector. And I hope to emphasize that if we bring people along with us on that process, the importance of briefing them, of giving them hand-holding and training, but also feedback and QA on their contributed data, we can really very achievably produce useful data, useful results that genuinely contribute. And I think the final thought I wanted to leave you with was that that it's maybe important to step back from what it is we're trying to achieve here and think about the journey that those people have been on in terms of learning about the archaeology around them, about learning how to think about it, how to interrogate it, and how to produce useful results at the end. Part of what we've been doing here, that process is as valuable as the end result. So as much as we've focused on a meaningful contribution, I think that in terms of evaluation of this project, the process is almost as important as the product. Okay, I think I've probably filled enough of the time, so I'll leave it there, and just the obligatory thanks to our sponsors who've made it all possible. Thank you very much.